This is part 2 of the presentation Lunar Sabbath Problems Galore. This episode is entitled Lunar Sabbath Calendrical Delusions.
Hello, dear listener. Welcome to this presentation coming to you from the home studio of Derrick Gillespie. I hope you will learn something significant from this video. At the end, please don't forget to share so that others can benefit. Thank you, and God bless you.
My name is Derrick Gillespie. I've been a Seventh-day Adventist for over 40 years, and I continue to defend the truth as understood by Seventh-day Adventists. In this new episode, follow-up of sorts, of the earlier video entitled Lunar Sabbath Problems Galore. In this episode, it is my intention to analyze carefully the historical aspects of the topic. We find that the Lunar Sabbath advocates in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, dissidents who are pulling away disciples onto themselves, teaching that the Sabbath is not a weekly observation on what is called Saturday in the Western calendar, but it is supposed to be fixed dates in the month of the calendar. We dealt with this and the biblical aspects of it in part 1. If you have not seen it yet, I would advise that you go to my YouTube channel and look for the video that you see entitled Lunar Sabbath Problems Galore. The icon on screen will help you to identify and locate it rather quickly. Very important that you watch that part 1 to get the biblical background as to why the Lunar Sabbath theory is in big problems. Now, what I'd like to do in this part 2 is to address the common illusion. In other words, people are led astray by the illusion that the Sabbath is to be observed on specific dates of Jewish months, and a lot of historical records are referred to fool the listener to think that in truth and in fact observing the seventh-day Sabbath of the Ten Commandments on a Saturday is a mistake. It is an error. I want to address these historical realities in this part 2 presentation to show clearly why the Lunar Sabbath is really an illusion. It's simply smoke and mirrors, and it will easily distract and easily lead astray someone who is not careful in their analysis of the data. And so the first thing I'd like to look at is the accusation that the observance of the Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath on a Saturday, has to do with the Romans who forced the Jews and early Christians to adopt a pagan calendar, which made the true biblical Sabbath become lost and confused, and therefore observing it on a Saturday was not what was observed in the time of Jesus or by Jesus and in fact the ancient Jews. We want to explore this in this presentation to see, is it really so? It is also claimed that a leader of the Jewish Sanhedrin in the 4th century, the mid 300 odd AD, forced upon the Jews a fixed calendar which caused them to observe the Sabbath on the wrong day, which now has passed down to the present Jews in modern times on a Saturday. And because this fixed calendar was forced upon the Jews by Roman persecution, Hillel the second of the Jewish Sanhedrin caused the Jews of today for the last over 1,500 years to be observing the Sabbath on the wrong day, which is not Saturday. We want to explore this, and before I get into it, let me just make it very plain that we are to be very, very careful of false knowledge. It is more dangerous than ignorance. Some people are dazzled and baffled by quotations by the Lunar Sabbatarians from the pages of history. And if you're not careful, they will pull a fast one on you by quoting historical facts which in and of themselves are true in some respects. But then they will fool you. They will pull the wool over your eyes if you're not careful about the details of the historical facts, and the interpretation they place on the historical facts can mislead. So beware of false knowledge. It is more dangerous than ignorance. And it's interesting that when we speak to the dissidents in the Seventh-day Adventist Church who are misguided on the matter of the Sabbath, it is almost impossible to convince them that they are wrong. And that is why I'm bringing this additional quote on screen, that it is almost futile. It is usually futile to try to talk facts and analysis to people who are enjoying a sense of moral superiority in their ignorance. I mean, we find that these dissidents, obviously in the minority in Seventh-day Adventist Church, and Lunar Sabbatarians in general are in the minority in terms of Sabbath keeping. We're talking now the Sabbath as in the seventh-day Sabbath. That's the only biblical Sabbath that is a true Sabbath. Seventh-day Sabbath. We find that these persons, these dissidents, in the minority, of course, they never listen to facts. They don't listen to reason, and they attack everyone, and they think that because they are being opposed, then they are some martyrs for their faith. Well, let's analyze carefully the facts in this presentation and discover who really is deluded. Now, on screen, I have brought up a particular sister from the Seventh-day Adventist Church who has now left the church over the matter of the Lunar Sabbath theory that she's now pushing as if her life depends on it. And you will notice that I have labeled her on screen as thoroughly deluded. And I have to speak the truth because that is the case. She is a perfect example of how someone can be led step by step down the road of error and will refuse to listen to reason. I remember when she was pushing the flat earth theory, still pushing that flat earth theory, that the earth is flat. I contacted her online privately, tried to speak to her, and she refused. I mean, I am a geography teacher who thoroughly understands the nature of earth science and how the earth really operates and why the basic things about the earth create the certain results that they do. She wouldn't listen at all. I am totally in error and deluded, and she blocked me on YouTube, she blocked me on Facebook, and would not listen to reason. Now, she's a perfect example of those persons who they are so superior in their ignorance that it becomes almost pitiful, laughable in a sense. But I have to speak the truth because she's one of those who is right now online attacking the Seventh-day Adventist Church as a former Adventist, attacking Ellen G. White as the founder and prophetess of the church, attacking the pastors in terms of this issue of the Lunar Sabbath. Well, her theory of the Lunar Sabbath, attacking the church's understanding of the seventh-day Sabbath to be observed on a Saturday. And so I'm going to use her as a perfect example to show you how some people in their ignorance can really mislead others. And that is why I'm using her as a classic example of someone who is deluded and he is helping to lead others astray. Now, Here she is in a recent presentation attacking a pastor, attacking the Seventh-day Adventist Church on the matter of the Lunar Sabbath. And while she was presenting the fact that the Lunar Sabbath occurs on specific dates in the month of the Jewish calendar, here she was, let me pause it so you can see it, dear listener. Here she was presenting something which I found really, really fascinating. And I say fascinating because it demonstrates how clearly ignorant this sister is. And not just ignorant of the facts, but ignorant of how the facts make her look very silly. Now here she is presenting on screen from a website called, let me zoom in so you can see, the website called lunarsabbath.com. There it is at the top left of the screen. And while she was presenting her case on the so-called Lunar Sabbath that is decided by the cycles of the moon, I've already shown in part 1 of this presentation how that falls flat on its face when you analyze carefully the biblical story or the biblical truth as it relates to the matter. But what I found fascinating is that here is a sister presenting what she calls the cycle of the moon for the month and using a diagram that totally makes her look silly. She is one of those persons who believe that the earth is flat. She believes that the earth is not round like a ball like all the scientists have discovered for the last over 2,000 years. In fact, even the Jews who once thought that the earth was flat have corrected themselves since the last over 2,000 years. And they now fully are on board with the truth of science that the earth is a globe, a sphere. But this sister continues to teach the error that the earth is flat. Now, if you notice, on screen she's showing what is called the phases of the moon using a diagram from a lunarsabbath.com website, which is actually totally opposed to what she believes about the flat earth. Now notice, here is the moon going around in this diagram, the sphere or the ball of the earth in a 28-day cycle. Now she's using this to illustrate her so-called lunar cycle of the month, and don't even realize how the very diagram she's using is making her look totally ignorant of the true facts. Why do I say so? In fact, it contradicts her own flat earth theory, and yet she is so blind and oblivious to the very diagram she's using that it actually totally opposes and contradicts her teachings. Let us see why I say so. Now, let's go to her flat earth theory and see how it makes her look rather silly. And that is why I'm telling you that the Lunar Sabbath advocates, they don't have a grasp of the true facts. They have a whole bunch of ideas thrown together which are so self-contradictory, it's amusing. Now, the flat earth theory goes like this. Same theory that the same sister believes to be true. Earth is flat like a coin. Above it is an upside down bowl like sky or atmosphere. And notice that the sky or atmosphere is attached to the edges of the so-called flat earth. And inside this tough atmosphere or sky, what they call the firmament. Well, in their language, the firmament is tough and cannot be penetrated. Inside this tough encasement, as it were, sun and the moon, as you can see on screen. And this she borrows from the ancient view of the Jews about what the earth is like. There you can see the same idea. Tough sky, moon, stars, and sun on the inside of this tough sky that is encasing the earth, which means there is no way you can use a diagram which is showing the earth outside of the earth itself, going around the earth as a ball. But that's what she did. Totally showing you how confused she is. This is the theory of the flat earth. Earth flat like a coin. Above it, sun and moon going around in a circle. And here is the illustration of it. Sun and moon, to be able to rule the day and rule the night, they have to be constantly going around in a circle like this, just directly above the earth, encased in the atmosphere or a tough sky that is like an upside down bowl above it. So there is no way that the flat earth theory can use the explanations of science to show the moon cycles going around the earth as that sister was doing. But it shows you how confused she is. She doesn't really understand. She doesn't even really fully, properly understand how the moon operates in relation to the earth and how the sun is in relation to the earth to give us day and night, to give us the monthly cycle, to give us the yearly cycle. Because if the earth was really flat, like what you're seeing on the screen, and the sun and moon going around in a circle above our heads to rule the day and the night, all you would have is simply change from day to night, day to night, day to night. There would be no monthly cycle. There would be no yearly cycle, because that is something totally incompatible with the flat earth theory. Now let me go to the real truth of the matter. Now, before we move on to the real truth, here is how the flat earth theory seeks to explain day and night. Notice, sun going around the earth on a daily basis to spotlight areas and create daylight, and the moon going around in a circle to have each place see the moon at night, because the moon is supposed to rule the night. Now, with this kind of operation, there would never be any monthly cycle or moon phases. Nowhere at all can you find any explanation for this that you're seeing on screen. It cannot be found in any science book. It cannot be corroborated by the facts of earth science. It's all made up and fictitious. But the sister grabs onto it and believes that it is compatible with the phases of the moon. Now let me just quickly take you to the truth. This is the truth that the sister was showing on screen in her video, attacking the church, not realizing that the very video, the very diagram itself that she was using to show the phases of the moon is a total contradiction of her own teachings. There you see the moon going around in a 28, 29 days. It's actually over 28 days. And that is why the month sometimes of 29 days, sometimes of 30 days, because you have to make the adjustment throughout the year, because the moon cycle is not exactly 28 days. But notice the moon is going around the sphere, the ball-like earth, and because of the different exposure, angle of exposure of that moon reflecting the sunlight, you are going to see different angles of light and dark on the moon itself as it gradually goes around the sun. Gradually goes around the earth each month. Now this is how it works. On screen you can see how is it that we end up having, everywhere you turn, the yearly calendar is over 300 days in it, because the ancients recognized that the seasons change, and when they go in a complete cycle from one season to the next back to the original season, it took over 300 and odd days. And that is why the earth's revolution around the sun is accepted as the marker to give us our calendar year. The sun above our heads, according to the flat earth that's going around in a circle, will never determine a year to be over 300 days, because it's not connected to the seasons. It doesn't show how the seasons change, because the flat earth theory is just nonsense. But when you look at the true facts of science, as the earth, as you can see in the diagram on screen, goes around the sun, gradually the seasons change, and you go through seasons and they return to the beginning season, and it takes, in every case, over 300 and odd days. That's what science has recognized. And while that earth is going around the sun each year to give us a yearly cycle, notice the moon is going around the earth every 29 days roughly, 28 and odd days to give us a moon cycle. But not just a moon cycle, but as it goes around, you have different angles of exposure of that moon to the sun and in relation to us observing it on the earth, and so we see the phases of the moon. That is perfectly, let me show you in an animated format and screen. Quick summary. There is the earth going around the sun and the moon going around the earth. And so everything works in harmony, where you will have the earth taking 365 and a quarter days. Now that we have all the scientific capabilities and technologies and instruments, we can be more accurate than the ancients were. We now know it is exactly 365 and a quarter days that it takes the earth to go around the sun, giving us a calendar year. The ancients did not have all the technologies and the preciseness we have today, so they were only able to get an estimate of it being over 300 and odd days. The moon going around the earth, as you can see, it takes roughly 28 and odd days to complete a cycle. And while that is happening, the earth is also rotating to change from day to night. Here we see it in another illustration, which makes it even more visual. We're noticing that as the earth rotates on its axis, it changes from day to night in terms of the exposure to the sun, in terms of the sunlight. And as the moon goes around the earth, everything is working at the same time in harmony. So as the moon goes around the earth slowly each month, you will have the changes in the phases of the moon, the angle of exposure to the sunlight, which is reflecting off its surface, giving you what is called the phases. But we also see the moon every night, and that is accounted for by the rotation of the earth from the dark side of the exposure to the sun, the light side rather of its exposure to the sun, back to the dark side. And that process continues non-stop. Earth rotating, day and night changes. Moon is going around the earth, giving us the moon cycle for 28 and odd days each month. Earth is going around the sun once every year to give us 360 odd days in the calendar. And hence, the natural changes in the season or the seasons, which can be measured and give you the rough estimate of the yearly cycle. That's what makes perfect sense. And therefore, the truth of the Bible is that the sun is what guides the daily cycle as the earth rotates on its axis, causing the combination of dark and light in 24 hours to give us one day. God himself established the weekly cycle from Genesis 1 and 2 and Exodus chapter 16. And the Jews have numbered those days in a cycle from that time until now. From Exodus 16 until now, they have been following the same routine of every day of the week numbered from 1 to 7. And then the moon cycle changes the various weeks, adding up to give you your months. And the months adding up. It's not arbitrary. It's because the earth goes through a cycle around the sun once every year, causing changes in the seasons, which you can literally predict when the seasons change until they come back around to the original season. Because of that operation, you end up with the calendar. Now, with that background, let's now go into, before I move on, let me show you the science behind the way the moon operates, so it can be better understood as I continue to explain in this presentation. Here we go.
The moon orbits around the Earth, much like the Earth orbits around the sun. But if you spend much time observing it, you will see that the moon is never quite the same from one night to the next. The moon has something we call phases, which means that it appears to change shape a little bit every night. To understand why this happens, we need to talk a little bit about the way the Earth and the moon move together in space. The moon orbits around the Earth, much like the Earth orbits around the sun. However, while the Earth takes about 365 days to travel once around the sun, 1 year, the moon completes its orbit around the Earth in only 29.5 days, or about 1 month. That's actually where the idea of months came from, the time it takes for the moon to complete one orbit around the Earth. And the words moon and month come from the same root. Orbits around the Earth, much like the Earth orbits around.
Okay, now that I've established the actual science behind why we have a calendar of days and weeks and months and years, let's now look at the arguments used by the Lunar Sabbatarians to try to fool people to think that we are no longer observing the biblical Sabbath when we observe it on Saturday. Now, the argument is that the Romans, from the time of Julius Caesar through to Pope Gregory the 13th, as you're seeing illustrated on screen, forced upon both the Jews and the Christians pagan calendars, which caused the Sabbath, the biblical Sabbath, to be lost, and it was never Saturday. Now, let's recap some history. The Julian calendar was introduced in 46 BC, in other words, before Jesus was born, roughly 40 odd years, and this was a solar calendar proposed by Emperor Julius Caesar of Rome. Now, how do we know that the charge by the Lunar Sabbatarians that the Sabbath was lost when the Romans forced upon the Jews in the 3rd century with Pope Gregory and Hillel the second, the Sanhedrin's president, forced by the Romans to adopt a calendar which caused them to lose track of the true biblical Sabbath? Now, on screen, I am showing you that that is not the case. From as early as the 1st century, the Romans were already identifying that their weekly cycle and the Jewish weekly cycle were in alignment, corresponded perfectly. They had both a 7-day and an 8-day weekly cycle. The Romans discovered that their 7th-day weekly cycle was corresponding perfectly with that of the Jews, and they were able to identify which numbered day of the week, which they named, was the real Sabbath of the Jews. Here, I'm reading on screen. Frontinus, a Roman soldier who lived from 40 CE to 103 CE, in other words, in our what we call AD, wrote a book on military strategy called Strategematicon rather. And he wrote this book in 84 AD. And in it he writes, The deified Augustus Vespasian attacked, in other words, this was the leader of the Roman troops that attacked the Jews and conquered them just as Jesus predicted. The deified Augustus Vespasian attacked the Jews on the day of Saturn, a day on which it is sinful for them to do any business. Notice the Roman historian is recognizing that the Jews who never named their Sabbath, 7th day of the week, it corresponded with their 7th day or 7-day weekly cycle. And that day on which they were observing the Sabbath was the day which they called Saturn. This happened long before there was any Gregorian calendar, there was any Hillel II, who was so-called changed the Jewish calendar to a fixed one to make the Jews observe a different day than the real biblical Sabbath. Not true. Here we see in the 1st century, long before all of that happened, the Roman historian recognized that the weekly observance of the Sabbath by the Jews was on the day they called Saturn. It goes even deeper than that. It goes even deeper than that. Even before the 1st century, we see the Romans continuing to have their weekly cycle correspond with the 7-day week of the Jews. And their weekly observance of the Sabbath was noted in the history books, and it corresponded perfectly with what they call the day of Saturn. Here we go. Before even the 1st century, the Sabbath was every Saturday weekly. How we know? A Roman historian, I'm reading on screen, named Cassius Dio, who wrote about Roman history, gives an account of wars waged between Rome and Judea. In it, he explains the capture of Jerusalem in, notice, 63 BC. This is when Julius Caesar originally conquered the Romans. And notice what the historian describes about the weekly Sabbath observance of the Jews. He says, as it was, they made an exception of what are called the days of Saturn. Notice, the days, not just one, but the days of Saturn. In other words, this is what the Romans would call that particular weekly 7th day in their own calendar, the days of Saturn. And by doing no work at all on those days, afforded the Romans an opportunity in this interval to batter down the wall. So obviously they weren't observing Sabbath on 8th and 15th and 29th and 22nd day of the month, as is purported by Lunar Sabbatarians. No, the Jews were continuing to observe the Sabbath on a weekly basis, corresponding weekly with what the Romans know to be, in their 7-day calendar, the days of Saturn. I continue to read. The latter, on learning of the superstitious awe of theirs, in other words, the Romans learning about this practice of the Jews, made no serious attempt the rest of the time. But on those days, which days? The days of Saturn. If it was that they were observing the Sabbath on the 8th and the 15th and the 22nd, it would not correspond with the Roman calendar, with the 7th day of their weekly cycle being the days of Saturn. It would not. So here we have clear confirmation that the Jewish Sabbath coincided perfectly with the Roman calendar, the 7th day of the Roman calendar being called Saturday. And so when they came around, in other words, the days of Saturn, the Sabbath on the 7th day of every week, in succession, the Romans assaulted most vigorously the Jews. Thus the defenders were captured on the day of Saturn without making any defense, and all the wealth was plundered. clear indication. Lunar Sabbath doesn't work. Saturday has ever been the recurring weekly Sabbath, or what we call in the West. It doesn't matter what you call it. Once it is identifying that numbered weekly cycle and that numbered day in the weekly cycle as corresponding with the Western calendar being Saturday, that's all you need to know. Cassius wrote, I continue on screen, that the Romans who learned that the Jews rested on the days of Saturday, which was known as Saturn's Day in Rome, attacked the Jerusalem stronghold on those days. Because it was a weekly succession, repeated cycle. They could predict it, and that is why they attacked them only on the days, the seventh day of their week, which coincided with the seventh day of the Roman 7-day week calendar, the day of Saturn, what we now call Saturday. So this was even before the time of Jesus. And in the time of Jesus, the practice continued. Josephus, Jewish historian, records, I'm reading on screen, that Agatharchides, a 2nd century BCE historian, wrote something quite interesting about Ptolemy's defeat of Jerusalem. Ptolemy was one of the Greek kings that helped to oppress the Jews, and this was 4 centuries, as you're seeing in bracket, before Jesus' day. And they observed the same thing, that the Jews repeatedly every week observed the Sabbath on a particular day. Notice, when Agatharchides had premised this story and had jested upon Stratonice for her superstition, he gives a like example of what was reported concerning us, and writes thus. Remember, this is a Jewish historian writing in the context of what happened to them as a people. There are a people called Jews. This is the Jewish historian writing, about what he observed the Greeks to have seen in their culture. There are people called Jews and dwell in a city, the strongest of all other cities, which the inhabitants call Jerusalem, and are accustomed to rest on every 7th day, on which times they make no use of their arms, nor meddle with husbandry, nor make care of any affairs of life, but spread out their hands in their holy places and pray till the evening. Now it came to pass that when Ptolemy, the son of Lagos, came into the city with his army, that these men, in observing this mad custom of theirs, instead of guarding the city, suffered their country to submit itself to a bitter lord, and their law was openly proven to have commanded a foolish practice. This is how the Greeks saw the Jews 4 centuries before Jesus Christ, observing the Sabbath weekly. Same 7th day that the Romans observed, which they called Saturday, and were able to conquer them using the same strategy. I continue reading on screen. Ptolemy was the general of Alexander the Great, who took over Jerusalem in 332 BCE. We see that the Jews would not defend themselves or take up arms on the Sabbath, which was every 7th day. Now, if I were to describe the Sabbath keeping practices according to the Lunar Sabbath Sabbatarians, Sabbath observed on the 8th and the 15th and the 22nd and the 29th, I certainly as a Greek would not observe that they were observing it every 7th day. If I were to describe, I continue to read, Sabbath keeping practices of Lunar Sabbatarians, I certainly wouldn't describe their Sabbath keeping as something they did every 7th day. Rather, I would mention that they only keep a Sabbath on certain days of the month. Therefore, it's quite evident that Josephus, Jewish historian, was describing the practice laid out for us in the beginning. In other words, just as God described it in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. When God created the first week and indicated that we are to rest every 7th day, and this was totally independent of the moon cycle. How we know that? When God himself introduced the weekly cycle for the Jews to practice their reckoning in relation to the Sabbath. He did not use the moon. He didn't say look up at the moon and determine the Sabbath. No, he used their daily diet experience. Eating of food, something as important as that. We have to eat every day, non-stop on a cycle basis, one day to the next. God used the manna experience to teach them. 6 days lead to the day of rest, and they would gather an extra amount of the manna on the 6th day. It would be preserved throughout the Sabbath, and then the cycle continues the following day, where they would go out each day and collect only rations for each day. And they did this for 40 years without looking up once at the moon to determine when the Sabbath of the week would come around. And after 40 years, Exodus chapter 16 is a guided missile to the error of the lunar Sabbath, about the lunar Sabbath being observed on the 8th and the 15th and 22nd and 29th, and then you skip certain days in the month called transition days, and all of this is simply misguided ideas concocted in the minds of the deluded. And so when we look at the facts, it is very clear that the weekly cycle was untouched by the later calendar changes made by whether Gregorian calendar or by the fixed calendar of Hillel. Why? Hillel II. Why? Because it is obvious that the Jews continued to observe this very same seventh day, which was then before Jesus' time, during Jesus' time, up until the 1st century after Jesus left earth, was always Saturday. And it continues today among the Jews. Now, dear listener, let me just bring to your attention before I move to the next point. I went to a official Jewish website. It's called Judaism 101. The official website address is jewfaq, jewfaq.org. And when I read about the Jewish understanding of the Sabbath and the weekly cycle, it perfectly corresponds with what I've explained in part 1 from the Bible, and so far in this part 2. Notice what it says on screen. Other than Shabbat, which means, of course, that's the Hebrew name for the Sabbath, the name of the seventh day of the week. The Jewish calendar doesn't have names for the days of the week. The days of the week are simply known as the first day, second day, third day, etc. Sometimes they are referred to more fully, of course, in Hebrew, as first day of the Sabbath, or in some cases it can be transliterated as first day onto the Sabbath, etc. And here the Jewish website points out what the day of the week is like. Let me bring it up on screen. The days of the week, rather, are like. There it is. First day. And they have made sure to make it correspond with Sunday in the Western calendar, because it did then in the time of Jesus, before the time of Jesus, and it still does today. The weekly cycle has not been interrupted by all the calendar changes. And in fact, let me give you the full weekly cycle. There it is on screen. First day, onto the Sabbath, Yom Rishon. Second day, onto the Sabbath, Yom Sheni, Monday. And it continues like that through Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And the Jews who know more about the Sabbath than anybody else on this planet in terms of the weekly cycle. There it is. Shabbat. Yom Shabbat corresponds perfectly with what is known in our Western calendar as the weekly, as a Saturday of the weekly cycle. What can I say? The truth is clear. It stands out boldly in its defense. It doesn't need any twists and turns and and complicated puzzles and mind games to fool those who are not studied in the word or who are not careful in the analysis of the historical data. Let's move to the next point. Before I move on, let me point out that why do I quote Proverbs 24 and verse 6? For by wise counsel thou shalt make thy war. You want to debate an issue? You want to defend the truth? Make sure you know your stuff. The Bible says, for by wise counsel thou shalt make thy war. And in the multitude of counselors there is safety. Lunar Sabbatarians are in the minority in terms of their views about the reality of the Sabbath. And I mean, if God entrusted the Sabbath to the Jews, and that was the most important day in their history, you must understand that they, in their large numbers as a nation, would know more about it than anybody else. In the multitude of counsel, I am going to stand on the side of what the Bible, in the multitude of counselors, there is safety. I'm not going to listen to the minority Lunar Sabbatarians who have come up with this new idea within the last 30, 40 years. The Jews for over 2,000 years have been observing the Sabbath on what corresponds perfectly with Saturday in our Western calendar. It continues to be so. It has been so. It was before the time of Jesus, during the time of Jesus, after the time of Jesus, and even when calendars were changed, which I'm coming to now, it remains so. Why? Because the weekly cycle is independent of the moon cycle, and that is why it remained in place. Now, the big argument is that the Gregorian calendar, which was introduced by Pope Gregory the 13th, forced another change on the world, and therefore the Sabbath became lost, and therefore observance of Sabbath on Saturday doesn't really correspond with the original biblical Sabbath. You already realize that that is not true from what I just showed you. But what the Lunar Sabbatarians do is they hide behind, they use this distraction of, yes, the Roman Church and the Romans imposed calendars on the Jews and on Christians. And therefore, as a result, Sabbath is lost because days were added to the calendar and all of that. Well, here's what really happened. The Gregorian calendar, which is used by the vast majority of the world today, has not in any way, 160 odd countries, has not in any way affected the weekly cycle as it was carefully guarded by the Jews and corresponded with the 7-day weekly cycle of the Roman calendar. Wasn't affected any at all. Let's see why. Now on screen, here you see, notice carefully, that October, when the calendar was changed in 1582, the weekly cycle continued just as the Jews knew it, just as it corresponded with the Western calendar of the Romans. And so Sunday remained Sunday, the first day unto the Sabbath. Monday remained Monday, second day unto the Sabbath. Remember now, it doesn't matter what you name them. The important thing is the numbered place that they holds in the weekly cycle. Tuesday remained Tuesday, Wednesday remained Wednesday, Thursday remained Thursday. The 4th of October in 1582. Now look close at the screen and notice what happened the following day. When Pope Gregory made the change, he added 10 days to make adjustments to the calendar, monthly cycle, yearly cycle. And that happens all the time. Even the Jews do it. The Jews, because they realize that the month can be a little tricky to keep track of. What they do from time to time, the Jews, have always done this. They would add an extra month, which is called a leap year month. Just the same thing that we do in the Western world, because the moon takes 28 point a fraction day to go around the earth every month. And these fractions, they add up over time. So you have to keep adding days to make adjustments to keep up with the real time. The same is true. It adds up over time to give you extra days. And that is why we end up with leap years And the Jews, for instance, because they noticed that as the year changes throughout the seasons, the months and the dates of their holidays, annual Sabbaths, Pentecost and Feast of Tabernacles and all of that, the Jews did the same thing. They realized that the seasons would not correspond exactly with their festivals, their yearly annual festivals each year. So they made adjustments in their calendar to have those festivals correspond with certain seasons. Because remember, the Jews, they were an agricultural economy. And so they kept their festivals in line with certain seasons. And because the month can be tricky, they have to constantly make adjustments to keep those festivals within certain agricultural seasons. So it was not strange for the Romans to be doing the same thing in terms of making adjustments to the calendar as time goes by. But notice what doesn't change. The weekly cycle remains the same. So the following day, Friday, when Pope Gregory made the change by adding 10 days in 1582 to October, the following day, which would have been the 5th, notice, it remained Friday. The weekly cycle remained intact. But Friday now became, instead of the 5th, it now became the 15th. Did it affect the Friday? No, it didn't. Did it affect the Saturday? No. So the Saturday, which would have been the 6th, if that change to the calendar was made, is now the 16th, but the Saturday remained in place. It still remains the 7th day of the week, and therefore there has not been any time lost whatsoever. The Sabbath remains in place as the 7th day of the week from then on till now. The argument is too that in the middle of the 4th century, 300 and odd AD, Hillel, who was the last president of the Sanhedrin, as the Romans tried to stamp out the remaining aspects of the Jewish economy. I remember the Jews were totally conquered in AD 70, just as Jesus predicted. Their house left unto them desolate. The Romans and the early Christians were generally opposed to the Jews. And Hillel, president of the Sanhedrin, what did he do in the mid 300 and odd AD? He did not adjust or change the weekly cycle any at all. What did he do? He set up a fixed calendar where every year the Sanhedrin previously would have to meet and determine, for instance, when is the new moon by observation of the moon. And they would also make adjustments to the calendar so that the festivals of each year, fixed on specific dates of each month, would correspond with certain agricultural seasons. And the reason why they had to make the adjustments, because with the added time each month and the added time each year to the calendar, it causes certain seasons, certain festivals to in a way move or drift and doesn't correspond with specific seasons rather of the year. In other words, certain agricultural seasons. So what did Hillel do? As it relates to the annual festivals, because those are the ones which normally are affected by the changes in the calendar in terms of when they would occur throughout the year. He established a fixed calendar. So the dates in the calendar wouldn't change, but instead of waiting each year to adjust the calendar, he introduced a fixed calendar where the festivals of the months and the years would be observed at specific times in specific seasons. So it was a forward predicting calendar that was fixed. But guess what was not affected? Guess what was not changed? The weekly cycle was not changed whatsoever. It remained the same. First day unto the Sabbath correspond with the Western calendar, Sunday. Second day unto the Sabbath correspond with the Western calendar, Monday, and so forth and so forth. The 7th day of the week remained the same, did not change in any way whatsoever. It remained in its numbered place despite these changes to the calendar. So all of the argument that the Romans forced upon the Jews and the Christians a new pagan calendar which caused the the Sabbath to be lost in relation to when it should be observed. Not true. Not true. And all you need to do is simply just take up some history books and check out for yourself the facts. Don't just watch YouTube videos from the Lunar Sabbatarians who twist the facts to suit themselves and add and pad. No. When you study the facts for yourself and you realize that everything they come with does not hold true, you have no choice but to avoid this false doctrine. As I close, I notice that the Lunar Sabbatarians have a way of running to the Jewish Encyclopedia and the Jewish Universal Encyclopedia to draw quotes to suggest that the Jews used to observe the Sabbath based on the lunar cycle. When I check every quote they come with, I discover that the quotes weren't coming from people who believe in the Bible and in God, but the quotes were coming from secular historians who were writing about the Sabbath and writing about the Jewish calendar from the standpoint of secular history. So they were, for instance, presenting their views that no one knows where the Sabbath came from. Origin of the Sabbath is uncertain. The reason why the Jews have a lunar calendar is because their ancients used to be moon worshippers, worshipping the moon as a deity, and therefore that's why their calendar was based on the moon. And every quotation that is drawn from the Jewish Encyclopedia to try to pull a fast one or pull the wool over the eyes of those of us who observe the true 7-day Sabbath on a Saturday, we realize that the quotations, they are questionable, and when you analyze them carefully, they are not coming from people who really believe in the God of the Bible. Yes, there are Jewish writers, but there are secular writers who present alternate viewpoints and not real Bible-based viewpoints. And that is why all those quotations which seem to suggest that Sabbath was observed by a lunar method have to be rejected and thrown out, coming from secular minds that are not grounded in the Bible. Higher criticism, it is called. And with that in mind, everything that the Lunar Sabbatarians have come with fall by the way when you analyze it carefully. With that said, I have no choice but to say, as for the Lunar Sabbath, it doesn't stand the test. Make sure that you avoid this false doctrine and send it back to where it came from, the pit of hell.
If you've been blessed by this presentation, don't forget to share it with others so that they can be blessed too. Thank you and God bless you.